Have you ever stopped to think, like, how something really personal, maybe your clothes, or even just an attitude, could actually ripple out and affect a whole community, maybe even a church?
Or, how big societal changes might start to subtly challenge beliefs people hold really deeply about, well, how men and women fit into life.
Yeah, exactly. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a specific source, John MacArthur's book, God's High Calling for Women. We're focusing on the bits that explore a particular passage, 1 Timothy 2:9-15.
Our mission really is just to unpack the arguments and the thinking in this source. We want to give you a clear picture of its perspective on women's roles, especially within the church.
Right. It's definitely a topic that gets people talking, a lot of discussion around it.
For sure. And just to be clear, our aim here isn't to take sides or anything. We're just trying to relay the ideas from the book itself.
Think of us as guides, just pointing out the key takeaways from this particular viewpoint.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Right. To really get what First Timothy is saying, we kind of need the backstory. Paul's writing to Timothy in Ephesus. What is actually happening there? Why did Paul feel the need to address women's roles so directly?
Yeah.
What was that whole environment like?
Well, Paul had put in serious time there, like 3 years, building up the church. But then word gets back to him that things are, well, going off the rails a bit.
Off the rails how?
Doctrinal problems, people weren't living godly lives, even issues with leadership. And specifically about women, the source says some were losing their focus on purity, living for pleasure,
Okay.
breaking vows because of lust, becoming gossipers, busybodies, that kind of thing. The source even points to 2 Timothy, where Paul mentions gullible women loaded down with sins who were, easy targets for false teachers.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really challenging place to pastor. So, with all that going on, how did this messy situation specifically show up in their worship services? What does the source say?
Yeah, exactly. The source interprets 1 Timothy 2 as focusing on how some women were maybe flaunting their beauty or their wealth, and it was distracting, pulling focus away from actual worship.
Right.
So that leads Paul to talk about their appearance specifically in that church setting.
And this is where it gets really interesting, the way the source unpacks modest apparel in verse 9. What does the original Greek tell us? Is it just about clothing?
Well, that's the key insight from the source. The Greek word for adorn, kosme, it means to arrange or put in order. And modest, kosmios, means well-ordered, well-arranged.
Okay.
But here's the kicker, according to the source. Apparel isn't just clothes. It's more like demeanor, attitude. A woman's whole preparation for worship. It reflects whether her heart is set on God or, on drawing attention to herself. It's about inner order showing outwardly.
So it's much broader than just fabric and style. It's the whole presentation, the whole attitude. And Paul wasn't just making a general comment, was he? The source says he was tackling specific cultural issues bleeding into the church.
Absolutely. The source points to 2 big ones. First, imitating Roman culture. You had Roman writers back then, like Juvenal, describing women obsessed with incredibly elaborate hairstyles, tons of expensive jewelry.
This is serious bling.
Oh, yeah. The source mentions Caligula's wife, Lolia Paulina. She apparently had a dress covered in emeralds and pearls worth, over $1 million today, and she even carried the receipts to prove it.
Wow.
The source suggests this kind of thing was about grabbing attention, sometimes even, and I quote, to entice men into illicit sexual relationships.
Okay, that's one influence. What was the second?
Just flaunting wealth, plain and simple. Remember, this was a time with a lot of poverty. Yet some wealthy women wore dresses costing, get this, maybe 19 years of wages for an average worker.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Intricate hairstyles with jewels woven in, gold rings, even gold on their sandals. The source even mentions Philo describing a prostitute decked out in gold chains and gaudy braids. It paints a picture of the excess Paul was warning against.
Okay, those examples really highlight the extremes. So does the source argue Paul was banning all jewelry? Or nice clothes altogether? Where's the line?
No, the source is really clear here. It says, quote, "The Bible does not forbid women to braid their hair or to own gold, pearls, and fine clothes." It actually points to Old Testament examples like Solomon's bride or the Proverbs 31 women who were adorned.
Right.
So the prohibition isn't against the items themselves, it's against using them for evil purposes, like flaunting wealth, drawing attention in an unwholesome way, or trying to attract lust and sexual desire, especially in a worship setting. It's about the motive.
The motive behind the adornment. That makes sense. The source includes a personal story from the author that really drives this home, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. A really stark example. He recalls a woman dressed inappropriately for church, handing him an expensive gold chain after a sermon, and there was a note soliciting him. And while he calls that an overt example, he stresses there are many more subtle solicitations that go on in the church. And this kind of thing, the source argues, can lead to serious problems like pastors falling into sin or churches dealing with immorality. It shows the real-world impact.
That's a sobering illustration. And wasn't there a church father, John Chrysostom, who had strong words about this too?
Yes, Chrysostom. He wrote something quite pointed, asking if someone coming to pray decked out with broidered hair and ornaments of gold had come to a dance, to a marriage, to a gay procession.
He called it hypocrisy.
Pretty much, yeah, hypocrisy. The core idea, fitting with the source's view, is that church is for worship, not a fashion show or a place for display.
Okay, so if it's not about banning things, but about the why behind them, how does the source suggest a woman can figure out if she's dressed appropriately for worship? What's the litmus test?
It really boils down to examining your motives. The source suggests asking yourself questions like, why am I wearing this? What's my goal here? Am I trying to draw attention to God or honestly to myself? Will this outfit stand out in a distracting way, or is it fitting for this specific setting? It draws a parallel to 1 Peter 3, emphasizing the hidden person of the heart, the gentle and quiet spirit. It's about the inside matching the outside.
Right, the internal reality reflected externally. So moving beyond the external, the source then talks about the internal attitude, specifically godly fear and sobriety. What do those terms mean here?
Good question. Godly fear, from the Greek eidos, isn't about being scared. It's more like modesty mixed with humility. The source describes it as a kind of shame in inciting lust or distracting others from worship.
Okay.
It implies, morally choosing to reject anything that would dishonor God. It connects to Jesus' warning about causing others to stumble. It's about reverence guiding actions.
And sobriety. That sounds like self-control.
That's exactly it. The Greek sophrosyna is best translated self-control. Specifically, the source notes control over sexual passions and desires. Interestingly, the Greeks themselves valued this highly. Euripides called it the fairest gift of the gods. Plato listed it as a key virtue, so it's about inner discipline.
And the source links a lack of this self-control to some pretty serious problems in the Ephesian church, right? Even involving leadership.
Yeah, it suggests this lack of self-control was a big issue, maybe even leading men to cheat on their wives. The source highlights Paul's requirement for elders and deacons to be the husband of one wife, literally a one-woman man, as a kind of safeguard against this trend.
Interesting.
It also mentions issues with younger widows in 1 Timothy 5 struggling with desires, suggesting this self-control challenge was widespread.
So it wasn't just Ephesus. Does the source mention other churches facing similar issues?
Oh, definitely. It points to Titus too, where older women are told to teach younger women things like being sober, loving their families, being discreet, chaste, good homemakers, obedient, all points toward ordered lives.
And Corinth.
And definitely Corinth, yes. 1 Corinthians 5 talks about serious sexual sin, even incest that was being tolerated, even boasted about. Some Corinthians were apparently trying to argue that sex was just like eating, purely biological. Paul hits back hard, urging them to flee from sexual sin.
It sounds like these issues were quite pervasive in the early church, and there's an Old Testament warning cited too.
Yes, from Isaiah 3. God judges the daughters of Zion who are haughty, walking with outstretched necks and wanton eyes. Their fine clothes and jewelry are taken away, replaced with stench and baldness.
Oof.
The takeaway message the source draws is stark. Wearing jewelry or expensive clothing is not evil, but wearing them for evil purposes is, again, it's the motive.
Right. Okay, let's shift to the testimony of women. The source talks about consistency. What's the idea in 1 Timothy 2.9?
Verse 10 says, "But which is proper for women professing godliness with good works." Proper here means genuinely good actions, not just looking the part. Professing means publicly claiming faith, making an announcement.
So actions speak louder than words.
Essentially, yes. If a woman publicly says she's committed to God, professing godliness, which means reverence for God, her conduct should match that claim. You can't really say you fear God and then ignore what his word says about behavior, according to this view. Your righteous deeds demonstrate the genuineness of her faith.
Okay, now we're getting to the verses that often cause the most debate. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. That's 1 Timothy 2.1112.
I have to start with the learn part. Why was emphasizing women's learning so significant back then?
It was actually pretty radical. Paul says, let a woman learn. It's a command, imperative mood. Jewish tradition at the time often didn't encourage women's learning, sometimes saw it as a waste of time. Synagogue life was limited for them.
And Greek culture.
Similar attitudes. Respectable women often led very private lives, weren't really out in public forums. So Paul's command, the source argues, is a strong affirmation of equality of the sexes in spiritual life and blessing. Learning was vital for everyone in the early church. Okay, vital. But then comes in silence. This word gets interpreted in so many different ways. How does the source explain this silence?
Yeah, that's a key point of interpretation. The Greek word hesychia just means silence or quietness. The source notes some people take it to mean a generally meek attitude, maybe allowing women to preach if they're quiet about it. Others take it to mean women should never speak in church at all.
So what's the source's interpretation?
The source clarifies that silence here, particularly in verse 12, means women are not to be the ones teaching or exercising authority over men in the formal church gathering. It's not a ban on all speaking.
And how does this connect to that other passage, 1 Corinthians 14:34, about women keeping silent in the churches?
The source links the word permit. In 1 Timothy, Paul says, I do not permit, to the idea that some women in Ephesus actually wanted to be public preachers.
So it was addressing a specific desire or push.
That's the interpretation presented. And Paul, as an apostle, is saying no to that specific role for women, the role of elder, evangelist, pastor, teacher. That's reserved for men only. And importantly, the source stresses the reason isn't about women's abilities, their psychological makeup or intellectual capabilities.
Okay, if it's not about capability, that raises the big question. How can you have subordination without inferiority? How does the source handle that?
That's a crucial distinction for this viewpoint. The source points to the example of Christ and the Father. It cites 1 Corinthians 11:3. Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ.
So the argument is?
The argument is that Christ submitted to the Father's will on earth. He was subordinate in role, but he certainly wasn't inferior in essence or being. That relationship is used as the model. Different roles don't equal different value.
And that mention of God's law in 1 Corinthians 14:34, you mentioned it links back to Genesis 3:16 in the fall?
Yes, the source suggests that part of the curse or consequence of the fall was the woman developing a desire to control the man, a disruption of the original order.
That's quite a connection. Now, I'm really curious about this Delphic religion thing mentioned in relation to 1 Corinthians 14. What's the historical link there?
Yeah, this is fascinating context. Across the water from Corinth was Delphi, famous for its oracle, the Pythia. She was a woman. She'd go into a trance, utter these incoherent sounds, and then male prophets would interpret them.
Okay.
So the theory presented is that some women in the Corinthian church, maybe influenced by this pagan background, or maybe just asserting themselves improperly, were misusing spiritual gifts like tongues and prophecy. It was creating chaos in their meetings.
So Paul's instructions were about order.
Exactly. Paul lays down rules in 1 Corinthians 14, limits on tongue speaking, need for interpretation, prophets speaking one by one, others weighing in, because God is not the author of confusion. So, in that specific context, telling women to keep silent meant they shouldn't be part of that chaotic, disorderly public speaking, especially not in an authoritative or disruptive way like the pagan priestesses.
Okay, so if the prohibition is about formal preaching or leading public prayer in the main church service, does that mean women can't speak God's truth in other ways?
No, not according to this source. It explicitly highlights women in the Bible who did speak for God: Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, Anna. Paul himself dialogued with women. The source affirms there's a time and place for women to publicly offer praise and show truth. The line is drawn specifically at taking leadership roles in the church during the formal assembly.
Got it. And what about subjection? 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, the head of woman is the man. How does that play into church leadership in this view?
The interpretation is that women are to submit to male leadership within the church structure. The source then touches on those cultural signs in Corinth, women covering their heads, seen as signifying modesty, submission to husband authority, and men uncovering theirs, signifying masculinity, headship.
Those head coverings.
Yeah. Paul rebuked men covering their heads and women not covering theirs during praying or prophesying. The source argues this wasn't about the covering itself being universally sinful, but about rejecting cultural symbols that affirmed God's design for male headship and female submission in that context.
And the praying or prophesying mentioned there.
The source suggests that praying, prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11 likely refers to less formal settings, maybe home groups or family worship, because the formal church gathering isn't explicitly mentioned until later in the chapter, verse 18.
So the overall point is about maintaining decorum, reflecting roles of submission and headship in public Christian gatherings.
Exactly. The source frames it as upholding God's design for relationships, which involves differing roles, and it includes a warning. When women reject these God-ordained roles in the church and family, it undermines God's foundational design and potentially threatens social stability.
Okay, let's dive deeper into verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. You mentioned the word permit. What's the significance of Paul choosing that word?
Right, epitropu, permit. The implication drawn by the source is that some women in Ephesus actually wanted this role. They were pushing for it.
An active desire.
An active desire, yes. And the source, again, links this back to Genesis 3, suggesting maybe that desire to control the man, stemming from the fall, was manifesting here. It reinforces the point that the New Testament doesn't show any women holding the office of pastor teacher.
And that specific Greek word for have authority, authentine, you said it's unique.
Very unique. Only used this one time in the New Testament. There's been debate about its meaning, but the source cites a study by George Knight concluding its standard meaning was simply to have authority over, not necessarily negative like domineer or usurp authority.
So interpretations suggesting it only forbids abusive authority are incorrect, according to this source.
According to the study cited, yes. The source argues the plain meaning is that women shouldn't hold positions of teaching authority over men in the church context. Men shouldn't be subordinate to women in that specific setting.
Okay, that's a clear stance. To avoid misunderstanding, what does the source say this verse doesn't mean? What activities are not prohibited?
Right. The source lists several things it doesn't forbid. One, it doesn't stop women from praying, just from leading public prayer in the main service.
Yeah.
Two, it doesn't forbid all teaching. Women can teach other women, children, and even men in certain situations, like Priscilla helping teach Apollos, just not authoritatively in the public worship service.
Makes sense.
Three, it doesn't deny women's spiritual gifts, including teaching or leadership gifts. They're just to be used in ways consistent with this understanding of roles outside of leading the main church gathering.
What about missions?
Four, it doesn't prohibit missionary work. The source praises women missionaries, but says they should operate within their God-ordained role. It gives Elizabeth Elliot as an example, teaching an Aka man how to preach, and he then preached to the church. That's presented as godly female leadership within the structure.
And the inferiority question again.
Five, crucially, it does not imply women are inferior. A different role isn't lesser value. The source actually argues that submission within God's design often brings peace, happiness, and contentment, calling it not a punishment, but privilege.
That's a significant framing. Okay, so the theological foundation for all this, the source says, isn't culture, but creation and the fall. Let's unpack 1 Timothy 2.13-14.
This is really the bedrock of the argument. Verse 13. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. The source interprets this chronologically and functionally. Adam created first. Eve created from him, for him, as his helper. Meaning, in this view, she was to follow his lead, live on his provisions, and find safety in his strength. This leadership helper distinction is seen as rooted in the very order of creation, not just a later development. It echoes 1 Corinthians 11.8-9.
Okay, that's the creation part. How is it confirmed by the fall in verse 14?
Verse 14 says, Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. The source portrays Eve as stepping outside her role, acting independently from Adam, engaging the serpent directly. She was thoroughly deceived. The Greek word exapatosh is apparently stronger than just being tricked.
And Adam's role in this?
Adam, though not deceived, then failed in his leadership role by following Eve's lead instead of obeying God directly.
So the source sees the fall as, yes, disobedience, but specifically as a reversal of the intended roles.
Exactly, a breakdown of that God-designed order. However, and this is important, the source still emphasizes Adam held ultimate responsibility as the head.
Even though Eve was deceived and sinned first.
Yes, because he was the appointed leader. The New Testament primarily links the fall to Adam's sin, like in Romans 5. The source suggests the fall sort of reinforced the idea that women function best with male leadership, that Eve was unable to lead effectively in that situation.
But doesn't mean women are inherently flawed.
No, the source explicitly says women are not more defective than men and stresses interdependence. Just as women need men, so men need women. It's about complementary design, not defectiveness.
Okay, now let's tackle that final, often perplexing verse, 1 Timothy 2.15. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. What does saved in childbearing mean here?
Yeah, this verse trips people up. The source is clear. Salvation, geez, over here, it doesn't mean spiritual salvation from sin, like getting into heaven.
How do we know?
Well, the future tense, will be saved. And the shift to the plural pronoun, they continue, suggests it's talking about women generally, not just Eve or Mary. So saved is interpreted more like delivered, preserved, safe, freed.
Delivered or freed from what, then?
Delivered, the source argues, from the stigma of a woman's originating the fall.
Ah, okay, so the idea is...
The idea is, yes, a woman, Eve, initiated the fall, leading humanity into sin. But in key ways, women also play the crucial role in, well, continuing the human race, benefit mankind by replenishing the race. And through raising children, they have this unique opportunity to lead the race to godliness through their influence. Motherhood gives dignity and becomes a woman's greatest contribution, counteracting that initial stigma.
The source gives some examples of this powerful influence, right?
It does, some really striking ones. Susanna Wesley, mother of John and Charles, praying daily for each of her, 19 children?
19, wow.
Yeah. And G. Campbell Morgan, the preacher, crediting his mother for his dedication, and his 4 sons became preachers too. Charles Spurgeon's father, saying he could focus on his work because his wife was diligently praying for the children. The children are well cared for.
That's powerful imagery.
So this godly influence in raising kids, especially when women continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control, is seen as what delivers women from any sense of inferior status resulting from the fall.
So pulling it all together, the source concludes that this divine order, as it sees it, creates a balance.
That seems to be the conclusion, yes. Men are to be the leaders in the church and the family, and women find their unique, crucial, and dignifying contribution, escaping any accusation of inferiority, primarily through their godly influence, especially on their children.
And the final warning.
The source warns strongly that for the church to depart from this divine order is to perpetuate the disaster of the fall.
Okay, so we've really dug into John MacArthur's interpretation of 1 Timothy 2 here.
Yeah.
We looked at the Ephesian context, Paul's instructions on appearance and attitude, the specific roles outlined for women in the church.
Yeah, and how the source grounds all of that in the creation order and the consequences of the fall, leading to this view of women's unique contribution, particularly through motherhood and godly influence.
It's certainly a distinct theological framework for understanding these roles.
Definitely a specific perspective. We've tried to lay out the main arguments and scriptural points presented in this source, just so you have a clear picture of its viewpoint.
So as you've listened to this deep dive, what stands out to you? How does hearing this perspective, the historical context, the interpretation of these verses, maybe challenge or inform your own thoughts about roles in community and life?
It makes you think, doesn't it? About things like motive, about humble service, the impact of spiritual influence, regardless of your specific role. Maybe consider how those themes apply in your own life, your own contributions, which kind of raises a bigger question, really.
It is.
How do any of us figure out and live out our own high calling, whatever that looks like for us? How do we do that in a way that lines up with our deepest convictions, whether those convictions come from this viewpoint or lead us to explore other perspectives?
Definitely something to mull over.
Yeah.
We hope this deep dive gave you some useful insights, maybe a few aha moments, and just a clearer understanding of this complex topic from this particular source's perspective.